We've been taught to view modern public schooling as a baseline human right, a free service that rescues us from ignorance. But have you ever actually calculated the true price tag of a graded school? Across the United States today, public education costs an average of over $17,000 per pupil every single year. For a middle-class family with 3 children, that's a staggering $51,000 annual bill. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The modern factory school is structurally and physically an industrial luxury. It is so bloated, bureaucratic, and high overhead that no individual family or local neighbourhood could ever afford to pay for it out of pocket. And in accepting the state's financial rescue, we made a Faustian bargain, surrendering the sovereignty of our children's minds in exchange for a subsidised holding pen. Today, we aren't just looking at the philosophy of education. We are running the hard numbers. From the Prussian roots of Horace Mann to the economic power of the one-room co-op, this is a deep dive into the price of the graded mind and how we reclaim a classroom our families can actually own. Let's dive in.
So imagine being legally compelled to lease a brand new, mid-tier luxury car, like let's just say a BMW, every single year.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But here is the catch. You are not actually allowed to drive it. You don't even get the keys.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Instead, you're required to park it permanently in this massive municipal lot down the street solely to support the local automotive bureaucracy. And the financing for this phantom car is quietly extracted from your property taxes, your income, and the inflation of your grocery bills.
Right, it's just siphoned away.
Exactly. And if you refuse to pay, the municipality literally seizes your home. Now, if someone proposed this system for cars, we would call it economic extortion.
Yeah, I mean, we'd say it's an absurd, mathematically unsustainable luxury. It would just bankrupt the middle class instantly.
But the wild part is, we accept this exact financial mechanism and, honestly, this exact price tag without even blinking, as long as that municipal parking lot has a sign out front that says public school.
It is a phenomenal way to frame the reality of the situation because it really just rips the romantic veneer right off the building.
It totally does.
We are so conditioned to look at these massive complexes, the brick, the glass, the paved parking lots, through this lens of nostalgia or civic duty. And because of that, we become entirely blind to the raw economics of it all. We see a schoolhouse, we do not see the factory.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We are putting on our hats as educational economists today to look strictly at the balance sheets, the structural overhead, and the historical mechanics of state-funded mass education.
Right.
We're unpacking a rather provocative thesis for you today. And that thesis is that the modern, age-segregated public school is not some inevitable milestone of human progress.
Far from it, actually.
Instead, our source material suggests it's an industrial-era luxury. It is a system so inherently bloated and resource-intensive that it fundamentally cannot survive on voluntary exchange. I mean, it literally requires coercion.
Yeah, and worse than that, its ultimate function might not even be education at all, but rather a mechanism designed to fundamentally alter the economic sovereignty of your family.
It's a huge claim. So to test that thesis, we're going to rely on a pretty phenomenal stack of empirical data.
Oh, absolutely.
We're looking at official expenditure reports from the National Center for Education Statistics, and we're contrasting that with demographic data from the National Home Education Research Institute.
We'll also examine this fascinating empirical working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. It looks at how traditional social networks managed child-rearing costs historically, which is super revealing.
Super revealing. And to understand how this massive system was justified in the first place, we will be diving into some primary historical texts, including the writings of 19th century reformer Horace Mann, plus some economic analyses by historians like John Taylor Gatto and E.G. West.
So let's jump straight into the mathematical shock, because if we don't ground this in the raw numbers, it all just sounds like, abstract economic theory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's look at the National Center for Education Statistics, or the NCES. This is the official data arm of the United States government for education. I want to pull the figures for the 2020 to 2021 school year.
Okay, lay it on us.
Total expenditures for public elementary and secondary schools hit $927 billion. We are hovering right around $1 trillion for a single year of operation.
When a number gets that large, it literally loses its meaning for the average person. $1 trillion is larger than the entire gross domestic product of many developed nations.
It's just monopoly money at that point.
Right. It is a scale of wealth extraction that is incredibly difficult to fathom until you break it down to the individual human unit. The NCES calculates that this massive budget breaks down to an average of $18,614 per single public school pupil enrolled in the fall of that year.
Over $18,000.
Yeah.
Per child, every single year.
It's staggering.
Now, let's look at how that is actually spent, because the data reveals a lot about the nature of the institution itself. The current operating expenditures, so the day-to-day running of the facility, make up about $16,280 of that.
Right, but that's not the whole picture.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Then you have capital outlays. That is the property acquisition, the construction of these sprawling buildings, the constant renovations. That adds another $1,833 per pupil. And
you can't forget the debt.
Exactly. Finally, you have the interest on the debt used to finance all of this, which tacks on another $501 per child. And depending on where you live, the burden is even heavier. Like Idaho is on the lower end at around $11,600, but New York is spending over $32,000 per pupil.
Wow.
The District of Columbia is sitting at an astronomical $37,835 per child.
You really have to keep in mind what these numbers actually represent, though. We tend to think of educational costs as, the salary of a teacher, some textbooks, maybe a chalkboard.
Right, the classic little red schoolhouse image.
Yeah, exactly. But that is not what costs $18,000 a year. That figure represents the structural, unavoidable overhead of maintaining a massive physical and bureaucratic apparatus.
The machine itself.
Right. It is the cost of human resources departments, enterprise operations, food services, pension liabilities, specialized testing software divisions, middle management, and, frankly, the incredible heating, cooling, and maintenance bills of these architectural behemoths.
So let's map this onto a typical household. Let's say you have 3 children. If the system is spending the national average of roughly $18,600 per pupil, the structural cost of warehousing and educating your 3 children in this specific model is somewhere between $51,000 and $56,000 every single year.
For well over a decade.
Yes, for like 13 years. Now, if a middle-class family earning, say, $80,000 a year were handed a bill for $51,000 in post-tax dollars to cover their actual share of this system.
Oh, they would be bankrupt by Thanksgiving.
Instantly bankrupt.
They absolutely would. And that impossible math leads us to a core economic realization. The modern graded school is inherently unaffordable for the individual family to pay out of pocket.
It's just mathematically impossible.
Right. The physical and administrative architecture of the system is fundamentally unsustainable on a voluntary basis. If communities were asked to voluntarily pool their money to fund education, they would never, ever choose to build a structure that costs $51,000 per family.
The system would collapse overnight.
Exactly. Because the architecture itself is fundamentally unaffordable, it requires state taxation to exist.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Yeah.
Because we are looking at the National Home Education Research Institute data, and they provide a massive contrast.
Okay, let's hear it.
NHEII estimates there are roughly 3.4 million homeschool students in the U.S. right now. And their data shows that homeschool families spend an average of just $500 to $600 per student annually.
Right, it's a huge drop.
So we're comparing an $18,600 public school price tag to a $600 home-based price tag. But are we really comparing apples to apples here?
What do you mean?
Well, the public school provides special education services, speech pathology, massive football stadiums, free lunches, economies of scale, and more importantly, isn't that $600 figure hiding the massive invisible cost of a parent's unpaid labor? If a parent stays home to teach, they are losing $50,000 or $60,000 in potential salary, right?
That is a phenomenal pushback, and you are hitting on the exact pivot point of the entire economic structure.
Am I?
Yes. You are right that the $600 figure does not account for the opportunity cost of the parents' labor in our modern economy. However, we have to ask why the modern economy requires both parents to work $50,000 jobs just to survive in the first place.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
As we will see when we get into the historical data in a minute, the heavy taxation required to fund the $18,000 per pupil school is actually one of the primary drivers forcing that second parent into the workforce.
Wait, really? It's a feedback loop.
Exactly. And as for the amenities, the stadiums, the specialized bureaucracies, the cafeterias, the economic question is whether those things are actually necessary for the intellectual and moral formation of a human being, or if they are just the symptoms of an industrialized system trying to manage populations at scale.
So you are saying the bloat isn't a bug. It is a feature of the specific model we chose.
Precisely.
Which really makes me wonder, how did education work before we chose this incredibly expensive model? I mean, if a community in the early 19th century couldn't afford to extract $1 trillion from its economy, how did they scale education without going entirely bankrupt?
Well, they used a remarkably low overhead endeavor known as the multi-age classroom, or sometimes called the monitorial system.
Okay, paint a picture of that for me.
Picture a single, modestly sized room. You do not have children segregated by their birth year at all. You have a wide range of ages learning together in a decentralized way.
So a 7-year-old and a 14-year-old in the same room.
Exactly. The master teacher did not try to deliver standardized lectures to 30 identical students. Instead, the older, more advanced children acted as tutors for the younger children.
Almost like an apprenticeship model, but within the classroom itself.
That is exactly what it was. And the economic brilliance of this is the sheer lack of capital expenditure.
Because you only need the one room.
Right. You need one room, not 12. You need one flexible educator, not a dozen specialized employees. The tools were incredibly durable, like slates that could be wiped clean and a few classic high-level books that were just passed down through generations. Education was a fluid, organic extension of the community, deeply integrated into the household.
And crucially, it did not require a human resources department to function.
Not at all.
But that all changed with Horace Mann. Our source material points to the mid-19th century as the real inflection point here. Horace Mann and other reformers traveled to Prussia, and they were captivated by the Prussian military and educational model.
Right. They brought back what we now call the graded system.
And I really want to pause here and unpack the mechanics of what grading actually means, because it sounds so benign.
It does. It just sounds like getting an A or a B or moving from first grade to second grade.
Exactly. But the economic consequence of grading a child is staggering.
It is the defining structural shift that caused the cost explosion we see today. The moment you decide to segregate children into 12 distinct birth year silos, you instantly, permanently multiply your infrastructure costs.
Because of the physical space required.
Think about the physical mechanism of this change. In the multi-age model, you have a flexible space. In the Prussian model, if you have children spanning 12 years of age, you suddenly require 12 separate dedicated rooms. You require 12 separate teachers who only specialize in one narrow sliver of development.
And because you have separated them, the older kids can no longer help teach the younger kids.
Right.
You have completely destroyed the organic peer mentorship that provided free labor and reinforcement in the old system.
Precisely. You have severed the natural social bonds and replaced them with adult, salaried professionals.
That is a massive shift.
And it doesn't stop there. You now need constantly updated grade-specific textbooks because a fourth grader cannot possibly share materials with a sixth grader anymore.
Oh, man. So the textbook industry is born.
Yep. But the real hidden cost is the administrative bloat. When you have hundreds or thousands of age-segregated children moving through a rigid 12-year pipeline-like products on a conveyor belt, the logistical complexity is just immense.
You need managers for the conveyor belt.
Exactly. You need principals, vice principals, guidance counselors, curriculum coordinators, and eventually standardized testing software just to ensure all the parts on the assembly line are moving at the exact same synchronized speed.
And you can see the ghost of this Prussian model right in the NCES data today. They break down where the money goes, by what they call function. Now, if I ask the average person on the street what an education budget is spent on, they will inevitably say instruction. Paying a teacher to teach.
That's the assumption, yeah.
But the data shows that instructional expenditures account for only about 60% of current costs.
Wow.
Yeah. Nearly half the money is vanishing into support services, enterprise operations, food service logistics, and massive capital outlays. The school ceased to be a simple community covenant and was physically transformed into a corporate plant.
To really drive home how unnatural this bloat is, we have to look at the fascinating empirical research from the National Bureau of Economic Research. Specifically, this is Working Paper 18350 by Berman, Iannacone, and Ragusa.
I loved this part of the source material.
It's so interesting because they weren't even explicitly studying education. They were actually trying to solve a demographic puzzle about why fertility rates dropped so drastically in Catholic countries in Europe between 1960 and 2000.
Okay, so how does that connect to school budgets?
Well, to figure out the fertility drop, they had to understand the historical mechanics of how those traditional social orders managed the astronomical costs of children and education in the first place.
Right, because before the modern welfare state or the massive public school system, these communities still had hospitals, orphanages, and robust schools. How did they pay for them without levying crushing property taxes?
They relied on high-trust voluntary networks. Specifically, the researchers looked at the role of religious sisters, or nuns.
Yeah.
These women operated as a massive decentralized economic subsidy for the community. Because they took vows of poverty and lived incredibly simple, low-cost lives within a communal structure, their labor was practically free from a market perspective.
Right, no salaries, no massive pensions.
Exactly. The researchers empirically estimated the multiplier effect of this vocation, and the math is just astounding. They found that a single religious sister functionally offset the educational and children costs for 300 to 400 children.
Let's really visualize that mechanism for a second. You have a tiny vanguard of individuals, these sisters, who are highly educated but have practically zero overhead.
Right.
They don't need middle management. They don't have massive pension liabilities tied to the stock market. They don't demand a fleet of maintenance vehicles. By living this simple vocation, they create an enormous economic umbrella that makes education incredibly affordable, if not practically free, for entire communities.
It is an organic, decentralized, high-trust solution.
And compare that historical reality to the system Horace Mann built. When you strip away a high-trust, voluntary network and replace it with a state-mandated graded industrial model, you are essentially replacing one nun with an army of salaried bureaucrats.
That's exactly what you're doing.
You replace that single vocational worker with an HR director, a district superintendent earning 6 figures, a diversity coordinator, a team of standardized testing consultants, and a massive debt servicing apparatus. You have replaced a low-overhead vocation with a high-salaried administrative state. Of course, the cost skyrockets to $18,000 per child. It literally cannot do anything else.
It's structurally designed to be expensive.
But this raises a massive historical mystery for me. If this graded system was so mathematically unsustainable from day one, how did early reformers convince the public to hand over their money?
That is the million-dollar question.
I mean, 19th century Americans were notoriously resistant to taxation. They had literally fought a revolution over it just a few decades prior.
Yeah.
If someone came to a Massachusetts farmer in 1846 and said, hey, I want to build a massively expensive multi-room Prussian school, and I'm going to tax your farm to pay for it, that farmer would have chased them off the property with a pitchfork.
Oh, absolutely.
So how did Mann justify the coercion? How did he sell this?
He had to fundamentally, philosophically redefine the concept of private property.
Wait, what?
Yeah. Mann was brilliant, and he recognized the obstacle immediately. In his 10th annual report to the Secretary of the Massachusetts State Board of Education in 1846, he openly admitted that the public instinctively foresaw that increased educational privileges for children meant increased taxation for adults.
You actually wrote about that, right? The rich man with no children who views a tax for his neighbor's kids as an invasion of property.
Yes. Or the man who already paid to educate his own kids privately and feels he is being double taxed. Mann knew the argument for state schools fell dead against the wall of the taxpayer. He needed a philosophical crowbar to pry the money loose.
So what was the crowbar?
His solution was a radical shift in legal philosophy. He argued that no individual truly owns their wealth in an absolute sense.
Okay, that's a bold claim for 1846.
Very bold. And his mechanism for this argument was nature itself. He stated that the primary elements of all wealth, the riches of the soil, the light of the sun, the winds, the streams, the rain, were created by God for the benefit of the whole human race across all generations.
Right.
Therefore, any wealth a person claims to have earned through their own labor is actually overwhelmingly derived from these common natural resources or from the discoveries and inventions of ancestors that the current individual had no hand in creating.
Oh, wow. He wrote this incredible line. Let me see if I can recall it. For every unit that a man earns by his own toil or skill, he receives hundreds and thousands, without cost and without recompense from the all-bountiful giver.
Exactly.
He was basically telling the Massachusetts farmer, you think you grew those crops. The sun grew those crops. The soil grew those crops.
Yeah.
And you don't own the sun or the soil.
Right. He argued that the earth and all past innovations belong collectively to the human race, meaning the current generation is merely a trustee holding a life lease on the property.
And from that specific premise, Mann derived his core legal mandate.
Right. Because all property is ultimately held in common trust, every single human being born into the world has an absolute right to an education derived from that property.
So the state steps in as the manager.
Exactly. The state, acting as the ultimate manager and executor of this collective trust, has a correlative duty to provide that education by taxing the property of its citizens. He argued that a child's right to be educated begins the exact moment they take their first breath, just as their right to sustenance does.
And he did not mince words about those who oppose this framework.
Not at all.
He stated that possessors of property who seek to resist this tax are guilty of the most far-reaching injustice. He literally wrote, the complainers are the wrongdoers. The cry, stop thief, comes from the thief himself. He equated the denial of this property tax to embezzlement and a fraudulent misuse of power. It is a stunning ideological reversal. He was stating that refusing to fund the state's educational apparatus was not a defense of liberty. It was a moral crime against the next generation.
And we really have to look past the rhetoric to see the economic utility of his argument.
What do you mean?
Mann realized that his vision of a standardized, highly structured Prussian-style school system was fundamentally incompatible with a free market of voluntary exchange. Private charity could never sustain the overhead.
It's too expensive.
Exactly. He needed the state to act as a single payer. He needed the coercive power of taxation to pledge the property of the entire Commonwealth to the education of the youth entirely on the state's terms. He manufactured the ideological foundation that allowed the state to fund the massive multi-billion-dollar overhead we see in the NCES data today.
So we have the mechanics of the expensive Prussian model, and we have Mann's philosophical crowbar to tax the public to pay for it. But what happens to the internal mechanics of the family unit once this massive machine actually gets running? Because this leads us to what I find to be the most devastating insight from our source material, the dual income trap and the atomization of the household.
Yeah, this is where it gets incredibly heavy. To understand this mechanism, we turn to John Taylor Gatto's Underground History of American Education. Gatto argues that the imposition of forced, graded schooling was not merely an educational reform. It was, at its core, an economic enclosure movement.
Okay, when I first read Gatto's phrase, enclosure movement, my mind immediately went to the literal enclosure movements in 18th century England.
The land enclosures, right?
Yeah, you had these wealthy lords fencing off the common grazing lands, preventing the peasants from raising their sheep. The peasants lost their independent livelihood and were physically thought to migrate into the smoggy cities to work in the new factories for a wage. Is Gatto implying the state literally fenced off children from the local economy?
That is precisely the mechanism he is highlighting. Yes. Historically, before mass compulsory schooling, children were fundamentally integrated into the household economy. They were not pets. They were productive assets.
That sounds harsh to modern ears. Productive assets.
It does, but it's economic reality. A child helped on the family farm. They assisted in the family craft. They took on significant household responsibilities like tending gardens, caring for livestock, or watching younger siblings. Their labor, even in small amounts, contributed directly to the economic viability and self-sufficiency of the family unit.
But forced schooling takes the child out of that household economy for 8 hours a day. It effectively severs their ability to produce.
Yes, and the economic shift is immediate. By legally compelling children to be warehoused in a state facility, the system transformed them overnight from productive assets into sheer financial liabilities.
Because they're not producing, but they still need to eat.
Exactly. They no longer contributed to the household's production, but they still required external care, feeding, clothing, and housing. This was a profound, unnatural shift in the economic mechanics of the family. You enclose the child away from the real economy.
And this triggers a brutal feedback loop. Let's walk through the actual cycle of family experiences. First, the state needs to fund this incredibly expensive $18,000 per pupil system, so the tax burden on the family skyrockets.
Right, massive property and income taxes.
A huge chunk of their income is siphoned off. At the exact same time, they have lost the productive economic value of their children, who are now legally required to sit in a classroom. This combination crushing taxation combined with the loss of household production creates a massive structural cost of living crisis for the family.
And what is the inevitable result of that crisis? A single income is no longer sufficient. Both parents are eventually forced out of the home and into the workforce just to survive the increased tax burden and the general inflation of the industrial economy.
The household can no longer survive through its own localized production or on the wages of one provider.
Exactly.
But wait. If both parents are forced into the corporate workforce just to earn enough money to pay the taxes that fund the school, then what is the school actually doing?
This is where Guido's analysis is so incredibly sharp. The macroeconomic pressure forces the school to change its primary utility from education, in the classical sense of intellectual and moral elevation, to state-sponsored custodial daycare.
Oh, man.
The economy is now structured so that parents must sell their labor to corporations or the state, and they absolutely require a secure holding pen for their children while they do it. The school becomes that holding pen. It is a custodial necessity disguised as an educational institution.
The family is completely atomized by this process. The home ceases to be a vibrant center of production. It is no longer a place of shared economic purpose, generational learning, or craft.
It's hollowed out.
It is hollowed out into a mere dormitory. It is just a physical location where atomized family members sleep between their assigned shifts at the office and their assigned shifts at the school. The sovereignty of the household is dismantled by the sheer economic gravity of the graded school system.
And it is absolutely vital to recognize that this was not a natural evolution of a free market seeking efficiency.
It wasn't.
No. This was a case of state intervention explicitly crowding out thriving, low-cost alternatives. We see this brilliantly documented in E.G. West's historical analysis, Education, and the State. West looked at the empirical data in 19th century England right around the time these state systems were being violently formalized.
This part fascinated me because what West found completely contradicts the standard historical narrative.
Totally.
The story we are usually told is that before public schools, the poor were just wallowing in Dickensian ignorance, completely illiterate, and the benevolent state had to swoop in and build schools to save them.
That is the conventional wisdom, but West's research completely shatters it. He found that in the 19th century, before the state established its monopoly, the vast majority of poor parents were actually paying voluntary school fees.
Voluntarily?
Yes. The private market was already providing highly affordable, highly literate options. There were dame schools, church schools, and mutual aid societies. The literacy rates were already climbing rapidly. The real obstacle to universal education wasn't that parents were negligent or didn't pay. The sole obstacle was poverty.
So if the private market was already working and poor parents were already educating their kids voluntarily, how did the state take over?
Through the weaponization of taxation, West reveals that public education in places like England was funded largely by regressive consumption taxes.
So let's explain how a regressive consumption tax works mechanically, because it is insidious.
It really is.
A consumption tax is a tax on basic goods that everyone has to buy, regardless of their income. Things like soap, salt, tea, or window glass.
Right.
If a rich man and a poor man both have to buy the same amount of salt to preserve their meat, the tax on that salt makes up a tiny fraction of the rich man's wealth. But it consumes a massive, devastating percentage of the poor man's income.
Exactly. The state was heavily taxing the basic necessities of the very same poor populations that it claimed to be saving with free education.
Unbelievable.
This regressive taxation placed an enormous, suffocating squeeze on the working poor. It effectively drained their disposable income, making it mathematically impossible for them to afford both the new state taxes on their daily goods and the voluntary fees for the highly literate, low-cost private options they were already using.
They bankrupted the competition. The state effectively taxed the poor into submission. By extracting their wealth through salt and soap taxes, they made the private options unaffordable, thereby crowding out the free market. The poor were then forced to send their children to the free state system, because it was the only option left after the state had emptied their pockets. The state didn't win because its schools were academically superior. It won because it had the coercive power to tax its competition out of existence.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of this entire deep dive.
Why do it?
Right. If this system is so inherently unaffordable, so destructive to the natural sovereignty of the family unit, and so reliant on coercion and regressive taxation, why did the state want it so badly?
Yeah, what was the ROI?
What was the structural return on investment that made the state and the industrialists who backed it so desperate to subsidize this massive high-overhead machine?
Power doesn't just hand out billions of dollars out of benevolence. There has to be a tangible benefit to the people managing the society. And we are turning back to Gatto's underground history here, and his analysis of a historical panic known as the demon of overproduction.
To really understand the state's motive, you have to put yourself in the mindset of the industrial and social managers between roughly 1880 and 1930.
The Gilded Age.
Exactly. This was the era of the Titans. It was the era of massive, unprecedented industrialization, requiring immense, concentrated capital investments to build mega factories, transcontinental railroads, and mass production assembly lines.
And the problem these industrialists faced was the American character itself. They were terrified of Yankee entrepreneurialism.
They really were.
The traditional ethos of the nation was that everyone wanted to be an independent producer. Everyone wanted to be a small business owner, a self-reliant farmer, an independent tradesman.
But from the perspective of a centralized industrialist, if everyone is an independent producer, you have a catastrophic problem for mass production.
How so?
Well, first, you have too much unpredictable localized competition. But more importantly, you do not have a reliable, docile workforce willing to perform mind-numbing repetitive tasks in a factory for 12 hours a day. And you do not have a dependable, homogeneous consumer market to buy the millions of identical goods rolling off your assembly lines. This was the demon of overproduction. If everyone produces independently, prices collapse, and the massive capital investments of the industrial elite go unprotected.
So the state and the industrial titans realized that to secure a predictable workforce and a dependable consumer market, that fierce, independent entrepreneurial spirit had to be systematically dismantled.
Exactly.
And the most efficient place to dismantle it is in childhood.
This is exactly why the Prussian model was so attractive to them. The Prussian system was not designed to create brilliant, independent, critical thinkers. It was explicitly engineered by a military state to produce obedient soldiers for the army, obedient workers for the mines, and citizens who exhibited absolute uniformity of thought.
It's about compliance.
Entirely. The bells ringing every 45 minutes, the constant shifting from room to room, the rigid hierarchy, the demand for permission to speak or move. These are not educational necessities, they are behavioral conditioning. The system was engineered to damp down the qualities of mind that lead to independence. It trains students to think of themselves not as free, sovereign agents, but as human resources competing for the favor of management.
We see this deeply functional view of human beings echoed in historical documents, too. Our source material quotes Thomas Jefferson's early views on education. Jefferson, long before the industrial boom, proposed a system where the best intellects would be, in his incredibly stark words, raked from the rubbish annually.
It's a brutal quote.
It is. He suggested sending the best 10 out of 20 boys to college, while the rest would be turned adrift or sent to labor. While Jefferson's wording is jarring to modern ears, it highlights a view of education not as holistic development, but as a ruthless sorting mechanism.
And that crude concept of sorting evolved into the sophisticated industrial goal of social efficiency in the 20th century. Social efficiency theory dictated that the goal of school was no longer the elevation of the individual soul or intellect. The goal was the stabilization of the social and economic order.
So the individual serves the system.
Right. The graded school was weaponized to sort children into distinct social classes and vocational tracks. The intention was to standardize human units, measuring them, grading them, and ensuring they fit perfectly as interchangeable cogs in a centralized command economy. It was about creating a mass population that would predictably produce and predictably consume exactly according to the dictates of the corporate state.
It acclimatizes the child to the rhythms of the factory and the cubicle, deliberately severing their ties to the natural rhythms of the family, the seasons, and the local community.
Which brings us back to the present day and the tactical return for you, the listener.
Right, because this is heavy stuff.
It is. But if we accept the historical and economic data that the modern graded school is an artificial, mathematically unsustainable construct subsidized by the state primarily to generate industrial compliance and atomize your family, what is the alternative?
How do you actually reclaim household sovereignty when the economic system is explicitly designed to trap you? The answer brings us full circle to the data we discussed at the very beginning. The alternative isn't some theoretical utopia. It is a rapidly growing reality.
We are witnessing an unprecedented rise in classical homeschooling co-ops, modern microschools, and parish guilds.
Yes, we are.
For a long time, the dominant cultural narrative dismissed these options as expensive elite luxuries or, as fringe antisocial behavior. But the economic data proves the exact opposite.
These low-overhead models are actually acts of radical economic liberation.
Totally.
By returning to a decentralized family or community-based model, you are completely bypassing the staggering $51,000 plus overhead costs of the industrial state school. You don't need to fund the massive HR departments, the multi-million-dollar buildings, or the fleet of buses. You need a dedicated adult, a few durable classic texts, a strong community of peers, and a commitment to genuine inquiry.
By opting out of the high overhead machine, families can begin to fundamentally rebuild their household autonomy. They can escape the dual income trap that was intentionally designed to keep them constantly running on the corporate treadmill just to pay the taxes for a system that actively undermines their family structure.
It reclaims the kids as assets.
Exactly. They can transform their children back from financial liabilities requiring state-sponsored daycare into integrated, productive members of a sovereign household economy.
It is a profound paradigm shift. So let's look back at the ground we have covered in this deep dive. We started with the raw math of the factory school, staring down the barrel of a $927 billion public infrastructure that extracts over $18,000 per pupil per year, just to fund its own bloat.
We explored how importing the Prussian age-segregated model caused these costs to explode by requiring massive administrative and physical infrastructure.
We then contrasted that bureaucratic bloat with the historical evidence of high-trust networks, like those Catholic social orders, where a single vocation could efficiently offset the costs for hundreds of children, proving unequivocally that education does not have to be structurally unaffordable.
And we examined Horace Mann's philosophical acrobatics, redefining property rights to justify coercing the public into funding this new industrial vision.
And finally, we unpacked the devastating economic feedback loop of the enclosure movement, how state schooling operates as a massive tax engine that forces both parents out of the home, turns children into liabilities, reduces the school itself to custodial daycare, and standardizes a compliant workforce for a centralized corporate economy.
The historical evidence strongly suggests that this architecture was built this way intentionally, to solve the demon of overproduction and enforce social efficiency, at the direct expense of individual liberty and family sovereignty.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up. We have established that the original economic purpose of this massive, nearly $1 trillion public school infrastructure was to standardize a workforce for 20th century factory and corporate life. But look around.
The world has changed.
Exactly. What happens to this rigid, high-overhead machine now that our modern economy is rapidly shifting away from factories and toward decentralized, remote, independent, and AI-driven work? The era of mass standardization is ending. Are we forcing our families to fund an obsolete 19th century industrial plant to prepare children for an economy that is already disappearing?
It is the defining economic and education question of our era. The factory is closing, but we are all still being forced to pay the utility bills.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you a new lens through which to view that massive brick and glass facility in your neighborhood. Keep questioning the architecture, and until next time, keep diving deep.
When you step back and examine the cold mathematical reality of the graded factory school, an undeniable law emerges. Anyone, any family, any church, any community that adopts the architecture of modern state schooling will inevitably be sucked into an economic vortex. The age-segregated, high-overhead machine carries an insatiable price tag. It demands specialized facilities, specialized bureaucracies, and endless administrative armies. It is a system designed so that the natural family unit can never afford it on its own, forcing parents, generation after generation, to crawl back to the state for financial life support. But let us set the dollars and cents aside for a moment. What is the true cost of this Faustian bargain? What is the ultimate price when we realize that to subsidize the factory, we surrendered the objective mind of the child? When we replace the search for objective truth, classical virtue, and generational wisdom with institutional compliance, standardized testing, and state-sanctioned conformity, we haven't saved money. We have traded the soul of the household for a custodial holding pen. The path forward does not lie in reforming an industrial cage. It lies in reclaiming low-cost, high-yield, family-centered education. It lies in rebuilding the village schoolroom co-op, restoring the domestic sanctuary, and raising a generation that knows how to think, build, and pray. Master your household, secure your perimeter, rebuild the realm.